My wife and I really enjoy playing board games with our daughters and with our friends. But there is one game my wife will not play, and that is Monopoly. She just doesn't enjoy a game where the whole goal is to grab everything for yourself and to grind the other players into dust. And you know, the truth is, I have heard a lot of people who have these horror stories of huge family fights from their childhood over the game of Monopoly. Maybe that's because we just temporarily set aside normal standards of right and wrong, and we embrace greed and just focus on money and crushing all of the other players. I don't know. Maybe it's just a game, so maybe it's fun to set aside ethics for a while, and maybe it's not so fun because people's feelings get hurt and it brings out the worst in some of us. What about when we handle and think about money this way in real life? The way that we use and think about money is an expression of our values, and our values are rooted in our beliefs. And the whole system of beliefs, the way that we think about the world and the way that it works, is our worldview. Our worldview includes things like who we think is in charge of the world, who's at the center of the world, and whether or not there's a God. These are the issues that are at the heart of the book of Proverbs. Proverbs states in its introduction that its goal is to teach us how to live skillfully and successfully. But in order to do that, we need to root our actions and our values in reality. Proverbs 1:7 says, "The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge." Proverbs doesn't provide us with a worldview, but it assumes a biblical worldview, that there is a God, that He created everything that there is and everything belongs to Him, that He acts upon the world and holds it accountable to His values. When we fear the Lord, and that worldview produces a distinct value system, what does that have to say about money? How does that impact the way that we think about money? Well, the book of Proverbs actually has a lot to say about money, but it focuses on three key ideas. First, when we fear the Lord, we value righteousness over wealth. Second, we promote justice. And third, we are generous to those in need. The first way that a natural secular worldview distorts our perspective is in the way that it teaches that our own pleasure is in our greatest self-interest, that the definition of success is wealth, and the way that we can accomplish what we want. The game of Monopoly is ruthless because we just discard virtue and focus on money at the expense of everything else. Unfortunately, something similar happened in the housing crisis back in 2007. Politicians forced banks to make loans to people who could not repay. Predatory banks made irresponsible, risky loans in order to bolster their bottom line. People were greedy, bought much more than they could afford, and took on huge debt. It was the pursuit of goods instead of goodness, and it was a disaster. But when we fear the Lord, we understand that some things are better than wealth. In fact, there is a proverb that is scattered throughout the book that scholars call better than Proverbs. And the idea is that one thing is so important that it is better than its opposite, even if great cost is involved. Listen to this example from Proverbs 16:8. "Better a little with righteousness than much gain with injustice." In other words, righteousness is so important to God that it is better to be righteous, even if that is accompanied by poverty, than it is to be wealthy and unjust. And Proverbs 19:1 says this, "Better the poor whose walk is blameless than a fool whose lips are perverse." Now, proverbs like this don't say that the poor are blameless or that it's wrong to be rich, but what they do is they prioritize virtue over wealth so that we seek virtue even if poverty is required in the process. When we fear the Lord, we have a worldview that completely reorients our thinking. If there is a God and He holds me accountable to His values, then my greatest goal in life is to seek His favor. I want to align myself with God's characters and values in order to set myself up for long-term permanent blessing at His hand. What about you? Are you willing to pursue righteousness before you pursue wealth? Are you willing to allow God to define the good life and to seek blessing on His terms? That is the key to long-term success, even if poverty is required here and now. When we fear the Lord, we favor righteousness over wealth. Now, there is a second way that a natural secular worldview distorts our actions, and that is in the violation of justice. Justice simply means that we get what we deserve, whether good or bad. If someone does what is right and works hard, she should get the benefit for that. And if she does what is wrong, she must face the consequences. And this is true whether or not that affects me negatively or positively. For example, if I know someone who is a friend, who is wealthy and powerful and well-connected, and they have the means to benefit me, and yet they do what is wrong, they must face the consequences for that, even if it is not in my own self-interest. On the other hand, if I'm in business and I'm in competition with someone, and they are poor and vulnerable and not well-connected, and they work hard and do what is right, they should see the benefit and the gain for that, even if it negatively affects my own bottom line. Now, the game of Monopoly is played by rules that ensure fair dealing, even though we're out to crush each other. But unfortunately, in real life, those rules are too easily broken. In the housing crisis, the situation was caused by relatively few people, and yet it had a negative impact on everyone else. Americans as a whole lost 1/4 of their net worth. The stock market crashed 45%. People lost value in their homes, they lost value in their retirement accounts. And in some ways, the world economy still hasn't recovered from the actions of just a few people. The housing crisis was caused by misguided politicians and predatory banks and greedy borrowers, but everybody paid the price. That is not justice. But when we fear the Lord, we promote justice because we understand that that is important to Him. The book of Proverbs warns us against the temptation against perverting justice. Listen to this example from Proverbs 17:23. The wicked accept bribes in secret to pervert the course of justice. This is a description of corruption. Someone who is well-resourced and has the assets may be tempted to pay a bribe, to get a legal case to go their way, to avoid the consequences for their actions. But injustice is not just unkind or even illegal. This verse calls it wicked because it is a violation of God's fundamental character. And Proverbs 22:2 says this, "Rich and poor have this in common, the Lord is the maker of them all." If I'm in a certain social position with certain resources, I may be very tempted to take advantage of someone who isn't lawyered up, of someone who is under-resourced and appears to be defenseless. But this verse reminds me that the Lord is the maker of rich and poor, and He cares for both. And injustice is not just an offense against the person, it is an offense against God, who created all of us. What about you? Are you willing to pursue justice in your own dealings and to uphold the rights of those around you? Sometimes justice costs us something, either an actual cost or an opportunity cost. But when we fear the Lord, we treat each other with justice. And then there's a third way that a natural secular worldview distorts our perspective about money, and that is in the area of generosity. Many people value caring for the poor, but the truth is that generosity is sometimes rooted in a kind of selfishness. Companies give money to the poor in their community because it enhances their image, and they can use it in a marketing campaign. People give to the local food bank because all their friends are doing it, and it gives you a kind of social status. Sometimes, when we give money to the poor, it's a way of controlling them. They become dependent upon that, and are disconnected from the value of work. In Monopoly, when one person begins to win, there's a snowball effect that makes it more and more difficult for everyone else to catch up. When I was a kid and I would play Monopoly with my sister, we would bend the rules in order to prolong the game. I don't know why we would do that, because it's already such a long game anyway. But we would bend the rules, and what we would do is give each other money in order to help the other person pay rent. But that just doesn't make any sense at all. That's not how you play Monopoly. The way that you win the game is by taking money from everyone else, not giving it to them. There just isn't any room in the game of Monopoly for generosity. But when we fear the Lord, when we are convinced of His existence and power and accountability, then that reconfigures our generosity with a new motivation and purpose. Proverbs 19:17 says, "Whoever is kind to the poor lends to the Lord, and He will reward them for what they have done." I mean, that is a stunning statement. God is so concerned about the poor that when I am kind to them, He considers Himself obligated to me. My kindness to the poor is viewed as a loan to the Lord, who then promises to repay me for what I have done. He owes me something for my kindness. And Proverbs 21:13 says, "Whoever closes his ear to the cry of the poor will himself call out and not be answered." There is such a close connection between God and the poor, such a care that He has for them, that it says in this verse that if I neglect them, He will neglect me. Now, verses like this still suggest that generosity ends up benefiting me if I am aligned with the Lord. There's still a motivation of self-interest, but it's a rightly ordered self-interest in deference to God's priorities and values. Generosity is good because it reflects the character of God who is generous. What about you? Are you willing to let go of your money more easily because you fear the Lord and His interests are more important than your own? When we have faith in God, it isn't enough to just avoid injustice. He calls us to actively care for the needs of those around us. When we fear the Lord, we are generous to those in need. Now, in some ways, the game of Monopoly is a great analogy for the natural tendencies and the ways that we think about money. We win the game when we get the most and drive everyone else out. But that is a distortion of the way that God intended us to live and work together. Our faith in God and our commitment to Him is the basis of an entire worldview that completely reorients our thinking about money. When we fear the Lord, we favor righteousness over wealth, we promote justice, and we are generous to those in need. Thank you.